Well, good morning, good morning, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones, and this is episode one in Treachery Begets Treason. And today we're going to be looking at the story of the Ultra Vires Act. Ultra Vires, Latin term, which means extra powers. As I mentioned in my introductory video, we are going to be looking at the period right after the Civil War. That's going to be the beginning of our 100 and approximately 110-year examination of the origins of the deep state. This treasonous cabal that gave us in the 60s multiple assassinations against not just presidents and potential presidents, but leaders of movements, and in thus doing so also overthrew the government, which is technically the definition of treason. So the roots of this go back to the incorporation movement, which is going to happen right after the Civil War ends. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, the formation of what we call an economic oligarchy. Oligarchy has been kind of a popular term in the news here recently. The Democrats have been throwing that term around. Of course, it's meant to be a pejorative term against Donald Trump and all his friends. But oligarchy technically means the rule by a few. So the intent is to show that somewhere along the way, heads of corporations or boards running corporations, because of their vast wealth, the creation of their vast wealth, which led to vast influence, has produced an oligarchy which is secretly running our country. They're not elected, they're not accountable to the people. That's kind of the origins of this deep state, this economic oligarchy. The Civil War, when you look back at it, it was about way more than just slavery. You know, midway through the war, Abraham Lincoln transitioned and made the war about slavery after the border states committed to the northern side. But that was to give the North something to fight for. You know, up until that time, they were fighting to preserve the Union. It's not quite the same rallying cry to try to preserve something as it is to fight for or against something. It also added the dimension of making the war a moral cause. And of course, it put the North on the side of the knight on the white horse riding to the rescue of these poor African American slaves. And it put the South on the defensive. So it had a multiplicity of effects and, of course, reasons to make this war about slavery. And Lincoln was itching to make the war about slavery. He just couldn't do it until Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland border states committed to fighting his side. There's a saying attributed to Lincoln. He says, "I'd like to have God on my side, but I've got to have Kentucky." You know. So once that was decided, and Lincoln gave his, the famous speech at Gettysburg, and then also emancipated the slaves. The war became an issue about slavery, and that's what most people grow up thinking, but it was a lot more than that. The North, it was about industry and the rules that are going to govern industry. The South had an idea that states would be supreme, and the North had an idea that the federal government would reign supreme. So it was a dispute about federalism, is what it was. And the northern states, prior to the Civil War, had become industrialized. It was their great advantage in the war. They could produce the armaments. They had plenty of people who had immigrated to America to work in these factories. The South was agrarian, stuck in the past, rural. And so they didn't have the railroads. They didn't have the armaments productions. They didn't have uh, the relationships with foreign countries, trade relationships the North had. So it took a while, but in due time, that advantage from a population standpoint, from an industrial standpoint, as far as capacity and output, from a wealth standpoint. Eventually, that reigned supreme in the Civil War, the North won. And, they were the ones producing the steel. They were the ones producing the rails and the railroads and all the other weaponry that was needed for the war. And it was a lesson. It was a lesson to the North in particular and to the South that money equals power. And entering the Civil War, most of the nation's money was in the North. And ergo, most of the nation's power was in the North. Now, as you know, when wars end and you sign a treaty or there's an unconditional surrender, as in this case, the winning side gets to set the terms. And so in the post-Civil War era, the North is going to betray its ultimate objective in the Civil War, which, of course, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments deal with the African American population in the South. So that was a priority as well. But included are sneaky little addendums to the amendments that have to do with federalism, that question that was to be answered by this war. And for example, in the 14th Amendment, most people associate the 14th Amendment with equal rights for African Americans. I used to teach my students, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were about closing loopholes. First, 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, and then the 14th Amendment figured out, you had to close a loophole because the South figured out other ways to discriminate against African Americans. And so they had to write a new amendment, affirmatively declared that African Americans had equal rights. And then another loophole appeared, which allowed for more discrimination in other ways. And so they had to pass the 15th Amendment. And it sort of played into this mindset in the North that Yankees had, that you couldn't trust the South, that if left to their own devices, they would always search for ways to return to the past if they could. And so it's one of the reasons why we ended up with a Reconstruction period to begin with, because the North felt like absent force, the South would stay stuck in the past. So the North was going to have to come down, force that change. Also, absent, there's going to have to be policy changes and statutory things written into the law, statutory authority given to the federal government. Because the North, that was one of the things they wanted. They wanted Washington to reign supreme over the individual states. And so snuck into the 14th Amendment was a clause that established the authority of the federal government over the states, prioritizing federal law over state law. And of course, this was immediately challenged in court. Federal courts upheld this new principle during Reconstruction. And this completely changed the old balance of power. This is not new. This is a fight that's been going on in America. It still continues to this day, right? You see executive orders and laws coming out of Washington constantly being challenged by different states, by different governors of states. You have half the country sort of living under one set of rules, the other half living under another. This goes back to the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists, back during the drafting of the Constitution. That was the hang-up that a lot of the Anti-Federalists had, was that the Constitution gave too much power to the federal government. And so they hammered out some compromises like the Bill of Rights. They got the slave trade compromise. They got there's a whole series of, even including the Electoral College, it's about giving some power back to the states. Amendment 10 guarantees that any power not specifically delegated by the Constitution reverts back to the states. So there's always been this controversy in America between states and the extent of their authority versus the federal government, the extent of its authority, who reigns supreme. So the 14th Amendment, as all these amendments and laws do, they have riders. And, there's what's publicly known about the amendment, and there's what's not so public. But it's just as important. It's just it matters just as much as what the public is aware of. So anyway, simultaneous to this was this northern, what had been started in the North prior to the Civil War. So these large companies. When the Civil War ended and peace broke out, now we can get back to the business of making money. You start to see the creation of this new form, this new business enterprise called the corporation. The idea was a corporation could be much bigger, much more powerful, much richer than just individually owned companies. And it spreads the risk rather than one entrepreneur risking everything for an idea and profiting everything or suffering the entire loss. You can now spread it out amongst stockholders. And so, without getting into a long, elaborate discussion about the corporation, the law or the act that was passed, we're going to discuss today, the Ultra Vires Act, that accompanied this creation of these new corporations, is what is really significant here, because these corporations had the potential to become bigger than the government, richer than the government, more influential, more powerful than the government. And as evidenced by this Ultra Vires Act, the government encouraged it. In fact, the this Ultra Vires Act is going to stipulate a couple things that really give a lot of runway to these corporations to get off the ground, and it gives them extra powers. The corporation, there were already laws on the books governing corporations, and now a lot of this is going to be trial and error. Like, for example, we're going to discover through the rise of these new corporations that there's such a thing as a monopoly. And turn of the century, we're going to have to deal with these monopolists, the Andrew Carnegies of the world, the Cornelius Vanderbilts of the world, John D. Rockefellers, etc. So these titans of industry, they got so big and so powerful, they had to be broken up, right? But that's in the future. What is in the present is we need to get these corporations off the ground, because it has the potential. The rise of these corporations has the potential to make America the richest nation on earth. And you really get down to it, that's the undergirdings of our entire economic models. It's all about the creation of wealth, capitalism. So you see the structure here. You got the stockholders. They're the investors that put in the money to raise up this company or this business, board of directors that runs it, a CEO who's in charge. And as long as the corporation turns out a profit, which then returns to the stockholders in the form of dividends, everybody's happy. But remember how there's laws that you would think that there would be laws governing the behavior of these corporations. For example, if you produce a product that is injurious to the public, somebody has to be held liable for that, right? Or if you break laws, you don't pay taxes or this or that. So they're under the same laws as individuals are in the United States, with the exception of a couple items that give them extra powers, which is the origin of that word, or ultra vires. That's the working definition of that word, ultra vires. The owners of the corporation were completely immunized against any personal legal liability. That's the advantage of a corporation. The individuals within the corporation are not liable for what the corporation does, not individually. Now, the corporation itself is, right? You could sue the company. The company could be taken, could be charged by the government. But as far as the individuals within it, they're immunized. And so it really gives you a lot of freedom within the structure of this company as an individual to work in an effort to make money, in an effort to create profits without worrying about all the time about being sued or being taken, charged with a crime, et cetera, et cetera. And really the only thing you got to worry about is not making a profit. As long as you make a profit, you can divide it up amongst yourselves, amongst all the stockholders. And your main concern is about creating more and more profits. All right, so what does this Ultra Vires Act do? Believe it or not, this is all going to tie into this deep state. You'll see why as we go along. This is the beginning of the story. The board of directors of the corporation had one duty, according to the Ultra Vires Act, and that was to maximize profits. They had no other consideration. Okay. In fact, it was a cause for termination if it was determined that a member of the board of directors considered anything other in any of his or her, mostly his decision making, like for example, the public interest. Should we pollute this river? What will it do to the public downstream? If the member of the board of directors is found to have considered anything other than profit, like for example, public interest, while making decisions relating to that company. In fact, if it was shown that he prioritized the public interest over the maximization of profits of the corporation, he would be fired for cause. Okay, this is a really big, important detail here because it's not a suggestion. It's not a recommendation. It's not a a qualification for a job. It is the job. It is the job. You do not consider the public interest. You do not consider anything other than the maximization of profits if you're on that board of directors, which of course includes the CEO. So now you understand the purpose of the corporation. It is exclusively the purpose of these corporations to make money. It's not just written in their bylaws for their corporate bylaws. It's a law passed by Congress that is the motivating principle of these corporate board members, CEOs. Secondly, they were immunized against any personal legal liability regarding the conduct of the corporation. Okay, we already covered that. So, if you want an example from today, think about the pharmaceuticals. The pharmaceuticals have long been, I think it's been since the 80s, when Ronald Reagan was president, immunized against any personal liability, legal liability. But they've also been, it's taken a step further, immunized against any corporate legal liability if their pharmaceutical products don't work out or cause injury. So like vaccines, for example. So that's something that we're dealing with today. Okay, so this isn't just something that happened post-Civil War that we learned our lesson. It is, and of course, it always has negative consequences because corporations, though it may be an entity, is made up of human beings, and human beings always take this too far. If it's about maximization of profits, that means that gives us liberty to do things against public interest. If it's about maximization of profits, it means I can do things and not worry about any personal legal liability, and indeed, even today, not even worry about corporate legal liability. And it really gives you a lot of freedom to do what you do best, which is make money at the expense of the public. And people sometimes wonder or think, the corporation should be doing stuff that's in the interest of the public. They shouldn't. That's not why they exist. It's written right in our bylaws, and it's according to this principle of ultra vires, they are actually forbidden from acting in the public interest. They can be fired for cause. Management officials, this immunization included the management officials like the CEO. The only entity that remained personally legally liable for any conduct taken on behalf of the corporation was the corporation itself, its assets. So corporations figured, well, to protect us, we will establish subsidiaries to hide our assets. Uh, the it, you could have unlimited number of subsidiaries spread out amongst all it spread out all your assets among them subsidiaries. And if someone tried to pierce the corporate veil to get at the real assets of the mother corporation in a lawsuit, for example, they would only be able to get these subsidiaries would hide, they'd be different names, different owners, different legal paperwork, et cetera, et cetera. And most of the assets would be hidden. You'd only be able to get at the assets within each individual subsidiary. That's to minimize their legal risk with regard to lawsuits. And then to minimize their tax liability, they established holding companies, we call them shell companies, to hold their profits. And so you see all along the chain of command, so to speak, or the hierarchy there, you've got asset protection, right? You've got the subsidiaries to hide the assets from the public. You've got the shell companies to hide your assets, your income from the government, so you don't have to pay a lot of tax. You're immunized against any personal legal liability. So if the government gets wise to what you're doing, they can't really hold anyone personally responsible for, just the company itself. Everyone's protected. Everyone. And of course, the number one job is to maximize profits. And if you are determined or found to be acting in the public interest in any way, shape, or form, you are fired. So you can see this is being set up in such a way that inevitably you're going to have a problem. It's not a matter of if, it's when. The corporation maintained that all of these subsidiaries and shells were totally separate and distinct from the mother corporation. Of course, they weren't. It's the same board of directors that ran all of them. This is how a small group of men, say 50 to 60 men, can run all the corporations of the country. You have a mother corporation with 15 shells, a mother corporation with 25 subsidiaries. You add all those up, 15, 25, that's 40. And then you got the mother corporation, it's 40. All because of one board of directors, all because of one original corporation. You got 40, 45 companies out there. Most of them are subsidiaries and shells, protecting their tax assets, protecting their assets from legal liability with respect to lawsuits, etc. But it's the same 7 men, for example, running the board for the mother corporation. It's running all these subsidiaries and shells. Now multiply that times all the different corporations that are springing up, and each board has 7 guys on it, or 9, whatever. And you can see quickly how 50 to 60 men can run all the corporations of the country. Which, if those corporations are the primary engines that drive the U.S. economy, that means those same 50 to 60 men are running essentially the entire U.S. economy. And if those are the corporations that have all the money that are donating to all the politicians, their campaigns, who are running, during their campaign for public office, at the state level, at the federal level, whichever, then that means those same 50 to 60 men are running the entire United States government. And they have and we talked about this, they have no accountability. They're not elected, so the people can't get at them, take them, vote them out of office. You can't sue them and get they're not personally liable. And they've worked out a system that has been blessed by this Ultra Vires Act, which means it's been blessed by the United States government to hide their assets from lawsuits, but also to hide their assets from tax liability. And they are completely insulated from any recrimination, from any accountability. And of course, their number one job is to make money. And if it comes at the expense of the American people, so be it. This is why there's there's a split amongst people who view the Cornelius Vanderbilts and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and you know they're either captains of industry or they're monopolists or tight. What was the other term for it? The captains of industry obviously was the the good interpretation. They gave people jobs, et cetera, created wealth, developed all these new products and things and things. But the opposite view is that they were screwing people, exploiting people, taking advantage of people, uh, combining all their businesses into these bigger monopolies that had to be broken up by eventually Teddy Roosevelt, progressive presidents, because they gotten so big, they were bigger than the United States government. And their operating principle is not on behalf of the American people. Their operating principle is to act against the will of the American people, if so be. It's all about profits. So these 50 to 60 men are insulated. Our politicians are out there. We every 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, whatever the term may be, we can vote them out of office if we don't like what they do. But you can't vote these guys out of office. They run the country and they're insulated. You can't sue them. You can't charge them with a crime. You can't get at their corporations. They've been broken into shells and subsidiaries. You can't vote them out of office. They're totally insulated. They're running everything. FDR, when he became president in the 30s, when in his book Looking Forward, he said, quote, "If the concentration of wealth and power goes on at its present rate, by the end of the 20th century, which would be the 1900s, we shall have all of America's industry and finance controlled by less than a dozen major corporations. They are owned and run by less than 100 men today. Putting it plainly, we are on and are still steering a steady course towards economic and political oligarchy. We think, as the American people, because, the Constitution establishes popular sovereignty. People rule. We vote in a president. We vote in 100 senators. We vote in 435 congressmen and an untold amount of state and local officials. And we think that gives us, the people, the power. Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, no, there's 100 men that are running everything. That is technically what we call a small group of people, which is the technical definition of an oligarchy. They're running the economy, so it's an economic oligarchy, but by virtue of their wealth, which we've already established, wealth equals power, they're also running the political arena, which means that they've established themselves a political oligarchy as well. In his speech to the DNC convention in Philadelphia in June 27, 1936, this is his second term. Quote, he says, "It was entirely natural to expect that the privileged princes, these oligarchs of the new corporate economic dynasties, thirsting for power and profit as they are, would reach out and seek control over the government itself. They have created a new despotism and have wrapped it in the robes of legal sanctions." What's the legal sanction? It's the Ultra Vires Act. And that act made it legal for this oligarchy to rise up. It made it legal for these oligarchs to run the economy, to run the political arena, all the politicians, to run the country. And FDR's point is this is a real problem. This is this counters the democracy or republic that we claim to be, which is ultimately ruled by the people. And so now at this point, everything is in the private sector. And an argument could be made that there's still a veil, there's still a wall of separation between the public sector and the private sector, even though that's theory, even though in practicality we know that the private sector is bleeding into the public because these oligarchs are controlling these politicians with their campaign donations, with their money. But an argument could still be made at this point in time that there's a wall of separation between the two. Ironically, it's going to be FDR that tears down that wall. And of course, I don't think he did it on purpose, but by necessity, he brought the private sector into the public sector and changed everything. FDR correctly diagnosed the problem, but because of World War II, and we'll get into that next, he brought these titans of industry, these capitalists, these some people, call them monopolists. He brought them into the government, and with them, he brought this mindset which governed their entire world in private sector, which is profit, 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 that don't take into consideration the public. It's all about profit. Immunize yourself, make money. And if it hurts the public, that's, too bad. Now, when that's in the private sector, you can still sort of buttress yourself, the government, the public, the public arena against that somewhat. When it bleeds into the public, into the government, and becomes part of public policy and government actions, et cetera, et cetera, now you have a problem. And it's FDR, ironically, who addressed the problem, diagnosed it, but then made the problem worse. And that'll be coming up in the next episode. So that's the story of the Ultra Vires Act. And I think you can see where this is headed. Okay. Thanks for joining today. Please consider subscribing to my channel. Smash the like button and feel free to share this. Also, comment if you feel led to. Until next time, God bless. Thank you.